Back to Matthew chapter 24. We're going to pick up kind of where we left off from last week. If you weren't here last week, I'll give you a second to review. We'll kind of pick it up, and just full disclosure, I don't think I'll finish it this week. We'll finish it next week because there's a lot going on. We'll see. I'm not even, just tell you up front, I'm not even entirely sure I'm going to finish your handouts today. We'll just see how it goes. But we're working through the statements that Jesus makes about, from our perspective, the future here in Matthew 24. And moving into chapter 25. So let me just kind of remind you of some of the ground that we covered last week. Just kind of spent most of last week just setting the context. I think this is a passage that you've got to kind of know going into it what Jesus and the disciples knew going into it. What their perspective is, what questions they were asking, how they're answering it. You can't just jump into this passage without some background to it. And so we spent some time last week looking at some of that background and realized how much this passage in particular connects with Daniel that we just finished walking through. That in Jesus in Matthew 24 and 25 is assuming that his disciples are familiar with the prophecy that Daniel gave back in Daniel chapter 9. Remember, that was a prophecy about Israel and Israel's future, 70 weeks determined for thy people, thy holy city, and God kind of laid out the program that included all the way up to Messiah coming. But then it prophesied that Messiah would be cut off, and the city would be destroyed, and the temple would be destroyed, and then there would be one more period of time, one more of those weeks, those 7 years for Israel's future. So when we get to Matthew 24, the passages leading up to that, Jesus makes it very clear to his disciples, 69 of those weeks of Daniel have taken place. The Messiah has come, and he's been telling his disciples, I'm about to be cut off. He even tells them at the beginning of this chapter, the temple's about to be destroyed, the city's about to be destroyed. That those first 69 weeks have passed, there's one more period of 7 years to go before the consummation, when I come back to fulfill all of my promises. So the disciples are asking the question then, what shall be the signs of thy coming and of the end of the world? They want to know more. Tell us more about that 70th week. Tell us more about that last week of Daniel, and we'll remind ourselves of that. But the big takeaway from all of this is to understand that when Jesus is giving these prophecies, he's talking about the tribulation period. When we do some more eschatology, we'll talk about reasons why the rapture of the church happens before these events. So he's not describing the church age. He's not describing the present age. He's not describing things that are happening for us as Christians. He's describing the future and specifically focusing on what happens to Israel during that time period. Now, the tribulation is a worldwide event. There's stuff happening all over the place, but Jesus is going to talk specifically about what happens in Israel during that time period. It's kind of like I warned my students that in 2 weeks they'll be taking final exams. So final exams, everybody in the school is going to be taking final exams. But I'm going to talk to them about their final exams, how their finals specifically affect them. I'm not discounting that everybody else is given tests too. I'm only going to talk to them about the test I'm going to give them. It's kind of the same idea. Jesus is acknowledging, and Scripture teaches that the tribulation is a worldwide event, but in this passage, he's talking particularly about how it affects Israel. There'll be some implications for some broader context by the time we get to the end of it. So, as far as content goes, this is where we're picking up now. What is Jesus actually telling them? And so, what we're going to look at in verses 4 through 14. I'm going to suggest to you that in verses 4 through 14, Jesus is going to kind of give them a summary of Daniel's 70th week, of that 7-year period. He's going to summarize the whole thing. They said, what are the events leading up to your return? So he's going to give them an overview of the entire time. So I put the chart up before that we did when we covered Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. Just to remind ourselves, this is the framework that Jesus is working with. So if you remember Daniel 9:27, he said that this tribulation period starts with a covenant between Israel and this prince that shall come, the Antichrist. Daniel said in the midst of the week, he would cause the sacrifice and oblations to cease. For the overspreading of abominations, he would make it desolate. Complicated way of saying this covenant is going to get broken. He's going to desecrate their temple somehow. And it would continue until Daniel said the consummation. Consummation is the fulfillment. That's when the Messiah is going to come and fulfill all of his promises to the nation. So we have a 7-year period broken up in the middle, ending with the end. As far as Israel's program is concerned, God fulfills all of his promises to them. So with that in mind, let's look at these verses and see how Jesus describes this time period playing out. Let's just read through them first, and then we'll go back and look at them more specifically. Verse 4. Jesus answered and said unto them, Take heed that no man deceive you. For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled, for these things must all come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in divers places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and ye shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. Then shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another. Many false prophets shall rise, and deceive many. And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. But he that shall endure to the end, the same shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. That sense of finality at the end of verse 14 is why I say I think he's describing the whole time period. He's about to back up and get into some more detail in just a moment, but he's kind of summarized this whole 70th week of Daniel. So let's notice some things that he says about it. How does he characterize, how does Jesus describe what Daniel's 70th week looks like? Well, he describes in verses 4 through 8, I would suggest to you the first half. Remember, Daniel divided it in half. Daniel said there were two parts of this. There was the time before the abomination and the time after the abomination. So Jesus describes, I think, this first half starting in verse 4. Look again at what he says here. Many shall come in my name, saying, I'm Christ, and shall deceive many. Daniel had said this time period would start with this prince that shall come, making a covenant with Israel, someone, we said, probably claiming to be their Messiah, maybe even helping them rebuild their temple. You shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. We saw some of those things in Daniel chapter 11. Remember, or in Daniel chapter 12, with the Antichrist having to fight some battles and defending himself, plucking up other horns and fighting warfare going on. Nation shall rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, famines, pestilence, earthquakes in divers places. Now, Daniel didn't talk about all of these events. Jesus is giving some additional information, but he said this is a time period characterized not just by wars and famines, but natural disasters are going on. It's a busy time, if you will. But notice verse 8, he says, all these are the beginning of sorrows. Now, that's an interesting phrase. That's actually a phrase that comes from the Old Testament prophecies about the day of the Lord. You go look at like Isaiah 13 sometime. He talks about this time period for Israel, this day of the Lord, this tribulation period. God calls it a time period, and he compares it to a woman going into the first stages of labor. That phrase here, the beginning of sorrows, is kind of a Jewish euphemism for a woman who's beginning to go into labor pains. That analogy, like I said, is used by the Old Testament prophets describing this time period for Israel, and it's kind of it's very appropriate when you think about the whole birthing process. That when the woman first goes into labor, there's pain and there's suffering, and it intensifies over time, and it gets really, really bad. Those of you that have been through this, you understand this. It gets really bad at the end, and then it produces life. There's a positive outcome at the end of it. That's an interesting analogy that God uses for this time period for Israel. You're going to go through it. It's going to be hard. You're going to face trials and tribulations. It's going to get worse, but there's great promises at the end of it. And Jesus describes this time period as the beginnings of that. This is the initiation. This is the starting of this process that's going to end with Israel getting her promises revealed and fulfilled. And so he describes this first half as a time of, yes, intense problems, wars, famines, pestilence, earthquakes in divers places. All these, he says, are the beginning of sorrows. And just like labor gets worse the closer you get to the end, Jesus, starting in verse 8, I think, indicates a transition. In the second half, he says, then they shall deliver you up. Now remember who he's talking to. This is instructions for the nation of Israel during this time period. Then they shall deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and you shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. And then many shall be offended, and betray one another, and shall hate one another. Many false prophets shall arise and deceive many, because iniquity shall abound, the love of many that shall wax cold. But he that shall endure to the end, the same shall be saved. He's promising them that there's going to come a point in time where this one that you thought was protecting you in the first half, when he demands to be worshipped in the temple, when he forces you to worship him, you're not going to comply, and he's going to seek your destruction. And we've looked at that both in Daniel, and we even looked at passages like in Revelation chapter 12 that talk about the Antichrist is going to seek to destroy the nation of Israel because they will not go along with him after this abomination. His goal is to destroy them, and ultimately he's carrying out the work of Satan and trying to get rid of the nation of Israel. If he can get rid of the Jews, then God can't keep his promises to them, and maybe he thinks he has a chance at winning. So it's going to be the worst persecution Israel's ever faced. Jesus will make a reference here in just a moment that this is a time, he calls it great tribulation, a time unlike anything Israel has ever faced before or will ever face again. It gets bad, specifically and especially for the nation of Israel in the second half of the tribulation. Persecution, there's going to be prophets who are trying to again, supporting the Antichrist, trying to direct people's attention to him, trying to pull people in that direction. But notice he promises in verse 13, he that shall endure to the end, the same shall be saved. Understand this context is not a salvation verse. This is not soteriology about how people get to heaven. He's not saying, this is not you got to persevere to the end if you want a shot at heaven. He's talking about literal preservation. Satan is seeking their destruction. The Antichrist is going after them. And Jesus is saying, hang on, there's promises coming. The fulfillment is at the end. You're going to see the end of those promises. Just hang on. Don't give in to this. Don't succumb. Don't believe the false prophets. Don't believe the false messiahs. You hang on, because deliverance is coming at the end. Will they be aware of the true Messiah? Will they have a context to reject error in face of truth? Yeah, certainly. Look at verse 14. And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations. While this for Israel is a time of worst persecution they've ever faced, it's kind of interesting. The scripture describes this as the time of greatest access to the gospel that the world has ever seen. This passage doesn't go into a lot of detail with it, but if you look at other passages that talk about the end times, Revelation's a book that talks a lot about this period of time. And it gives a lot of indication about the message of the gospel still going out during this time period of the tribulation. So this passage isn't dealing with it, but in Revelation it talks about two witnesses that are preaching during the first half of this time period. And the Bible says in chapter 11, all of the world is aware of their message. I mean, that's easy to understand in our day and age where, somebody could be saying something in Jerusalem today and all the world is aware of what they're saying. You put it up on the screen and everybody can see it. Well, that's going to happen during this time period. People are going to hear the gospel, and even the nation of Israel will have access to the truth. Revelation chapter 7 talks about 144,000 Jewish missionaries who are protected and preserved by God during this time period to apparently accepting the message of the prophets and proclaiming the message of the Messiah that he's coming. And the Bible talks about untold multitudes of people who come to know the Lord during this time period, probably as a result of that witness. Revelation 14 even describes at one point during the tribulation an angel flying through the heavens. It says, preaching the everlasting gospel of the kingdom. Talk about God pulling out all the stops to make sure that not just the world, but especially in this context, his people Israel, get access to the message. They will know the truth. What we're going to see by the end of this, and remember this towards the end of the Olivet Discourse, when we get to the end of this period of time, every person, the Jews included, every person on earth will have had access to the message of the gospel. What we're going to see at the end of this passage is when Jesus comes back, he immediately just separates. Those who have trusted him on one side, those who have rejected him on the other side, and those that have rejected him are taken off in judgment. Those who have accepted him are going into the kingdom. I mean, it's pretty cut and dried. What about those who haven't heard? There won't be any in that category at this point. By the time you get to the end of the tribulation, there's no excuses. They'll have seen, the Antichrist and his message. They'll have heard God and his message, and they'll make a decision. They'll be in one of two categories. I accept Christ or I accept the Antichrist. So when he comes back, that division is going to be pretty cut and dried. It's not going to be like this past election where you have the undecided votes. It's not going to be any undecided votes. Everybody's going to be in one of those two categories. Now, particular here is Jesus is pointing out to Israel, remember what's necessary for Israel to receive her promises is that she's got to be right with God. She'll have that opportunity. During this time period, when she's going through this intense persecution, she'll have no choice but to cry out to God for deliverance, to get back right with God. And that's what's going to facilitate her receiving all of her all of her promises. So in verses 4 through 14, he's kind of given the big picture. He's kind of zoomed out. This is what this 70th week looks like, particularly as it pertains to Israel. Now starting in verse 15, he backs up and gives a little more detail, a little more information, specifically about that second half. Because this is the time of most intense persecution of Israel, this is the time where things are more terrible than they've ever been before, he's going to back up and give some additional instruction. So some things that are going to help them as they're seeking to make it to the end, if you will. Notice what he says in verse 15. When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. So Jesus is telling us the time frame here. He says when that happens, so you're halfway through, this abomination of desolation that Daniel talked about takes place, and he's kind of assuming that this is going to get written down for this generation of Jews to have access to. So I can picture Jews during the tribulation reading Matthew 24. Let him that readeth understand. Well, here's what you need to do at this time, nation of Israel. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Again, this is one of the things that we said, why this is not a message, just in general for the church age. He's talking to a very particular group of people at a very particular place at a very particular time. When the abomination has taken place, those of you that are in Judea, you're going to have to leave. Why? Because that's where the Antichrist has set himself up. He's there in the temple. And if they refuse to submit to him, he's going to seek their destruction. It's a good time to get out of Dodge. You don't want to hang around. He's coming after you because you won't submit. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop come not down to take anything out of his house. You don't have time for that. Neither let him which is in the field return to take his clothes. Woe unto them that are with child, and them that give suck in those days. Pray that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day, for then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. He's warning them during this time period that after the abomination of desolation, this is where it gets bad. And Daniel talked about this. Remember, Daniel talked about the 1260 days where the Antichrist would specifically torment and go after the saints of God, the people of God, the nation of Israel. Jesus is reminding them, this time of great persecution, you need to flee for your lives. Kind of interesting if you remember from Revelation 12 that we looked at briefly last week, when Satan is cast down and it says that the dragon goes after the woman and chases her into the wilderness for a time, times, and half a time. That's this time period. That's this time of, she's got to get out. She's got to flee. She's got to go and hide. Now, it is a time of great protection, though. Even though it's a time of great persecution, look at verse 22. It says, and except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. In the midst of this greatest of persecutions, they also have a great promise from God of His divine intervention to protect them. That God is controlling this whole situation. From their perspective, it looks like it's out of control. Like, oh no, we've never faced anything this awful before. And God says, but don't panic. I'm in control. He uses a phrase here. He says those days are shortened. The word shortened has the idea of limited. You shorten something. You put boundaries on it. Like, we set boundaries for our semesters. We determine when classes begin and when classes end. We have shortened the semester. They're not indeterminate semester. Students feel that way. This is never going to end. Yes, it's going to end. There's a definite time period where it's going to come. That's already been predetermined. That's already, all you got to do is make it to the last day of the semester, right? And because there is a point in time where it ends. God says, I've shortened the days. I determine when this begins. I determine when this ends. I've set boundaries. And we know that from Daniel. God says, look, it's not going to start until I let the Antichrist make this treaty with Israel. It's going to end with me destroying the Antichrist. I've set boundaries. And this passage says if God didn't do that, this persecution is so intense that they probably would all be wiped out. I mean, that's how bad this is. I mean, he's got a legit shot if he's given enough time to literally wipe out all the Jews. But God says, I'm not giving him that much time. It's 1,260 days. It's time, times, and half a time. It's ending at the end of 7 years. It's going to stop. Now let me pause there for a second. I know this is Israel during the Antichrist. But that's still your God. There hath no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will with the temptation provide a way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. You know, God limits what we go through as well. That the same God that's protecting Israel here has set boundaries for you, that He doesn't allow Satan to go beyond. Remember the story of Job? I mean, Job went through it, but Satan couldn't do anything to Job that God hadn't approved, and said, that's as far as you can go. This is where it has to stop. Every one of those, God set boundaries. Again, this is not talking about you and me today, but that's the same God, and His character doesn't change. God sets bounds for us. He knows what we're going through. He knows what we need. He protects us. He provides for it. There are going to be times in your life where you're like, Lord, I can't take anymore. This is too much. And God says, I've got boundaries. I've shortened the days. You can trust me. I'll keep my promises. Good reminder from this. And He's talking to Israel during the tribulation, but this is our God. Verse 23, He gives them some additional warnings during this time period as far as some special temptations for Israel. He says, if any man shall say unto you, lo, here is Christ, or there, believe it not. For there shall arise false Christ, false messiahs, shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch if it were possible, they would deceive the very elect. Behold, I have told you before. He said, there's going to be people during this time period, not just the Antichrist. I would imagine, because he puts it in the plural, there's going to be other people during this time period trying to take advantage of the Jews' situation, trying to, rally them behind them, trying to get power for themselves, and apparently even able to do signs and wonders. I know Revelation talks about a false prophet who's able to do all sorts of great deeds, and Jesus says, look, I'm warning you, that's not the true Messiah. They don't represent me. Don't be tricked by it. Don't be fooled by it. Again, application for us today, there's, again, lots of false teachers that exist out there, and it's crucial that we know what the Bible actually says so that we can tell the difference when somebody says something wrong and somebody says something right. Don't fall for false teachers. But during this time for Israel, it's going to be a real temptation, because they are in that process of still trying to figure this out, trying to understand who their Messiah is. So somebody claiming to be the Messiah, well, maybe, look, he can do a miracle. How do I know? Maybe he is, maybe he isn't. Jesus is saying, look, I'm telling you in advance, don't fall for those false prophets. Why? He says, when I show up, when the real Messiah gets here, you'll know it. Verse 27, for as lightning cometh out of the east and shineth even unto the west, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. The Son of Man from Daniel 7 that's going to come to establish His kingdom. Jesus says, when I show up, nobody's going to have to tell you about it. Nobody's going to have to, hey, the Messiah. You'll see it. Be like lightning flashing in the sky. It's going to be obvious, unmistakable. He says, for whithersoever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together. Now that verse kind of feels like, well, where'd that come from? Again, that's another Old Testament judgment description of God. Probably for us, an analogy would be circling buzzards. If you ever drive down the interstate and you see the birds circling just off the interstate, and what does that tell you? You know something's dead down there. It's kind of a judgment kind of image. Jesus is saying, when I come back, I'm dealing with my enemies. I'm dealing with the judgment. And Revelation even talks about how when Jesus does arrive, the armies that He defeats that are coming after Israel, the Antichrist and the world that's kind of gathered together against Him, says that when He destroys them, it's kind of a gruesome image, but He talks about, blood up to the horses' bridles, so much carnage. And the way God cleans up the mess is He brings in big flocks of birds to take care of the leftovers. Trying to be good here. Jesus says, look, when I come back, it's going to be obvious. There's going to be death. There's going to be destruction. The enemies will be defeated. You're not going to wonder, is Jesus back? Is the Son of Man coming? You're like, it's going to be clear. So you're not going to have to fall into any of these traps of somebody saying, hey, come out into the wilderness. We found the Messiah. Or He's hiding over. And He's like, no. That's not going to be necessary. When I come back, it's going to be unmistakable. So what happens when He gets back? Remember, the disciples have asked, what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the age? Jesus, tell us what happens. Tell us more about how this is going to end. Jesus gives them an instruction here, gives them a statement about the ending. starting in verse 29. He says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, after this 7 years is done, those days shall the sun be darkened, the moon shall not give her light, the stars shall fall from heaven, the powers of heaven shall be shaken. Again, kind of an unmistakable event when Jesus comes back. Then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. Then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Another Daniel 7 reference there. And he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to another. Another verse to keep in context. I know it's been common in times past to kind of pick up on the trumpet imagery there and gathering of elect imagery there and look at that as a rapture verse. Remember, he's just said this is at the end of the tribulation. And the group that he's been talking about the entire time has been the nation of Israel. That's also appropriate to refer to Israel as God's elect. I know that's a good New Testament church word too, but that's a very good Old Testament word for the nation of Israel. They're God's chosen people. Remember, we just saw in verse 15, they've been scattered because of persecution. At the end of this 7 years, he's got to fulfill his promises to them, which include Deuteronomy 30, regathering the nation together to be his representative people, set up his kingdom over them. So this verse here is not a reference in this verse to the rapture. This is a reference to God regathering Israel together to fulfill his promises. It's okay if he blows a trumpet for them too. Okay, that doesn't take anything away from 1 Thessalonians 4. We'll look at that passage later. 1 Thessalonians 4, he's also going to blow a trumpet to gather us together with him. But this trumpet and this gathering is of the nation of Israel at the end of the tribulation, so that he can fulfill his promises to them. So he's technically answered their questions. What shall be the sign of thy coming? Well, I've told you what's going to lead up to it, and you'll see that sign of the Son of Man right at the end. What at the end of the world? I'm going to regather you to fulfill my promises. He's going to now continue this idea of warning for them, though. Because keep in mind the bigger context of what's been taking place. Technically, their Messiah has already come. Messiah came at the end of the 69 weeks, right? Messiah came. He's been preaching, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. But what did they do? They rejected him. They didn't listen to his message. They're about to allow him to be cut off, which is going to result in those other judgments taking place. I'm going to suggest to you that the nation of Israel wasn't ready for the Messiah the first time he came. He came, he was prepared, all the prophecies were fulfilled, everything was in line, and he announced himself and proved himself and showed himself to the people, but they rejected him. They weren't ready. So now, when he comes back the second time, he's going to remind them repeatedly.